Hello everyone, welcome to Knick-Knack Minis. My name is Tom. Thanks for tuning in today. So recently I had the opportunity to pick up the Dread Pageant, the Slaanesh Godseekers warband for Warhammer Underworlds, and I painted it live on my Twitch channel. And I was hoping to take that footage and just kind of turn it into something interesting and give you a quicker and more fun explanation of why I paint and how I paint, especially some of the decisions that I make along the way. And so that you don't have to watch a 2.5 hour to 5 hour long video in order to get the full experience. So we're just going to dive in. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and tune into my Twitch channel if you can, and like and subscribe. I'm going to try to upload things a little bit more frequently here. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so here we are diving into the base. It is already primed and zenithaled, obviously. And one thing I do want to point out is that the way that I paint is typically I take the base in the model and I separate them, especially for push-fit models like Veselic the Gifted. The reason I do this is because I just find it very difficult to paint the two of them together, and I find that I miss a lot of the base if the figures are already connected to it. And I do this for basically everything that I create. There's very few figures unless there's no other choice where I connect them. So I prime using a Vallejo primer, I've zenithaled using a white ink, and I am about to just dive into the paint job because it's ready to go. And then once the base is done, I'll connect the fig. Alright, so let's dive in here. The first thing we're going to be doing is deciding the scene, and I decided that this should be a desert. Like, this obviously looks like sand dunes kind of blowing in. I get the impression that Dire Chasm's a pretty dry place, also a dire place. So what I did was I just grabbed a little bit of Boss Chestnut from Scale 75, and I just started going to town on the base. The next thing that I do is I take that pure khaki color, and this is Vallejo Buff. And I take that pure khaki color and I just begin to wet blend it in over top. So this brown layer is neither opaque nor fully dry. And I'm just very quickly coming in over the top and doing a very thin layer of this bone color or this khaki color over top. Once again, you can use whatever you want. Zandri Dust, Ushabti Bone if you're using Games Workshop. Any sort of sandy, warmer tone will work for this. What you're essentially doing is you're just creating visual complexity on the model at this point. I'm also making sure to catch that skull, and as we progress and we let our layers dry, I'm working more and more of our lighter sort of sand and bone color, and I'm working those up as layers over top of what I've previously put down. The effect that this is going to have isn't going to be immediately apparent. You're going to need to put down a few layers before you start seeing this take effect. But essentially, all miniature painting is just sort of gradually building up impressions and remembering that our paints are often see-through, they're transparent. So putting one layer of Vallejo Buff down is not going to make it look like a sand dune. You're going to need to do 2 or 3 to make it work. The next thing that I start doing is I take a Games Workshop contrast paint, Basilicanum Gray. It's basically just a very dark gray wash, and I start to paint it all over the stone parts of this base. And the reason that I'm doing that is because the zenithal looks very nice and it gives me a great sort of basis for light, but I want to darken it down and I want those recesses to be dark and shaded. I don't want to get this on any of the areas that I've painted sort of sandy brown, but I do want to get it sort of all over the rest of the model here. So now that we're done with the basing steps, we're going to take a big fat makeup brush and we're going to cover it in our bone color, which is Vallejo Buff. And we're just going to draw it across the entirety of the base, including the sand dunes. And the reason that makeup brushes are so good for this is because they're super cheap and dry brushing destroys brushes, but also because they just get great coverage. They leave this really great dusty effect. So this is perfect for this nice, like, sort of blown over dusty base in this sort of like forgotten corner of the world, the effect that we're going for. And the next thing we do is we attach Veselic the Gifted to the base. So this is the first time we sort of see him all put together, and we see that that base is sort of nicely done. The only thing we're missing there is the skull, but we'll get that later when we start working on the bones and smaller details. All right, so this is where the fun begins. I paint in a slightly different fashion than your average sort of like Games Workshop heavy metal style painter. What I do, and I think that this is actually easier, is I take a zenithal model and I take a very thin, very straight brush, very small brush with a very sharp point, and I work up a very bright color onto it, something like a bright ivory from Procurl, which is what I'm using here, and I sketch in all the texture and all the detail all over the model. And what this does is it brings out that texture and detail for later steps, but it also familiarizes me with the model completely. I know where all the tiny little details are, and on Games Workshop models like this can be a real pain. So as you can see right here, I'm sort of working on this tabard that he's got, and I'm sketching in details. I'm sketching in the texture of the tabard itself, and this sets the stage for the rest of my painting style. So by taking a small thin brush, and you can see what I'm doing here on his loincloth, and just doing tiny scratches and hatches and painting in the fabric and the texture of the fabric, I can make a final product that looks really good really quickly. Basically all I'm doing here is painting in light values. So rather than using colored paints to do it, I'm just using blacks and whites in order to get a lot of the contrast that I want later on. So this is a really fast and simple way to do that, and it lends itself to speed painting by giving a really nice effect, because we spend all of our time at the very beginning finding details, finding texture. It's a really good way to become familiar with a model, and then you come with the color later on, and you basically just sort of, it's like blocking in colors. And you can call it quits there. And so you can see how this is kind of working out. You'll see this model slowly come together as we just paint texture onto it. So as we come to the end here, you can start to see how the texture, the skin, the cloak, the fur, the weapons have all been sketched in, and it provides a huge amount of information that we can use later in this paint job to get a really nice effect really quickly. And so that's why I really like to sketch on my models like this, and I did the same thing for the others in the warband. Before I begin blocking in colors, before I put any metallics on the model, etc. You can do the same thing with a dry brush as well. If you want to be really quick about this, you can just use a big fat dry brush the entire model, and you'll get a very similar effect. So one of the things that I wanted to explain here was how to make a glaze. And you can see I've got some very thin contrast paints here. It looks like a brown and a red. And what we're doing is we are just taking those contrast paints, which are already fairly thin, mixing a tiny bit of them together, mixing some medium in with them, and the result is a very thin glaze that we can use on this model. Alright, here we go. So we've blocked in our textures, and now we're taking a mixture of Gilliman flesh and just a tiny drop of a red tone when we're glazing all of this on. So these are contrast paints, but I'm using them as glazes with different mediums inside them to change their properties. You can use you can use contrast paints straight out of the pot if you'd like to. I tend to make them a little bit thinner so I have a little bit more control. The idea being that if I want more intense, more opaque colors, I can do a couple layers of them. But if I overdo it, it's not a huge deal. So if I have thin paints, I have a lot of control over what looks like what. And so you can see how the scarification on Vasilik's leg is all painted in white, and I'm coming in with this flesh tone and just sort of basically blocking it in. That's just blocking in color, and it looks more or less flesh-like at this point, and when it dries, it will look pretty good. Sure to get his arm here as well, and you can see on the leg as it dries, the glaze starts to fade out, and leave the flesh looking like flesh because we've painted our light values onto it. So it's basically just tinting everything to look like flesh the way that it's meant to. And this is the really nice thing about using contrast paints. So it leaves him with a very dark, very sort of sinister skin tone that's not going to distract from the overall paint job. And using a very light purple contrast paint, Magos Purple, I do the exact same thing here. Contrast paints are wonderful tools. You can make your own glazes if you want to. So you don't need these contrast paints as products if you don't want to buy them. I know they can be quite expensive. You can make your own using just the colors that you have at hand, a lot of water, typically around 10-to-1 water to paint, and a little bit of medium, just a drop of medium to give it some body and some consistency. But as we go, you're going to see this guy basically explode with color as I just start placing paints all over him, nice thin glazed paints. And I may return to some areas and make them more purple or less purple or change their tones, etc. So one of the things I wanted to do here was to paint in some really bold colors, and I thought for this guy, like, what's bolder than tiger stripes? So I started painting in some black ink and some black contrast paint to get the darker stripes first. And then later I painted in some bright orange and then highlighted in some orange on top of that in order to get the final tiger stripe effect. And I think it looks really good. I'm also one of those people that really struggle with black leather and getting black leather to look really good. It's actually a really difficult texture to nail. But what I found was really great about this technique was that using some really thin down black Templar and the undercoat and the undersketch that we did, just with a very thin glaze of that black Templar, I was able to paint on something that really ended up looking, to my eye at least, like black leather. So just using some very limited and very simple colors, we're able to create a really neat effect that I think works really well. And I'm really starting to like the way that this model is coming together. So earlier you saw me do the undersketch. You saw me sketch out the values of light and where things would be most reflective, as well as sketch in some texture. And the point of that was that you were going to be able to see the undercoat. I was basically painting in texture beforehand and then tinting it to make it look like it belonged. And with metallics, it doesn't really work. And I think that this is an area that I could really improve on because I wasted a lot of time basically painting out all these really cool little areas on the shield and on the edges of his armor where I'm going to paint gold. And at the end of the day, it just doesn't show up because these Vallejo metal colors are so heavily pigmented and have such good coverage that basically they instantly obliterated all the work I did. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. Certainly I will be remembering this for the future, and you try to get better with every paint job. So I think that in the future I will not do this for anything I choose to paint metallic. I'll just paint it metallic and then I'll figure it out later. So one of the things that I like to do to make armor pop is I take a product called Tamiya Panel Liner. This is Tamiya Panel Liner Black that you're seeing me using right here. Basically what it is an enamel-based paint, I believe. And all it does is, because it has very strong capillary action, it runs into recesses much better than any sort of acrylic paint. So it's better than any Nuln Oil, it's better than any ink for doing this kind of work. And it's black lining areas in, so it's giving them incredible amounts of contrast by separating areas with pure black. You can see me hitting the eyes here. You can see me really just like blocking in this shield. It works incredibly well for these purposes. It's something that I highly recommend you do on armor, and it's something that I highly recommend you do on something like this, which is, this model is very colorful, and this black really helps to delineate those areas and increase the contrast of that color. So grabbing my original brighter color here, I went back over areas that I felt were lacking a little bit of oomph, and I re-highlighted them, especially this black leather and Vasilik's scarification on his leg. It was just kind of fading into the background because a glaze will sort of unify an entire area. And this additional highlight let everything sort of stand out and shine. And I think you can see just how much it brings this black leather back out and makes it look very worn, but also very standout-ish. It stops looking just sort of like washed black plastic and starts looking like a real texture because of this. The other thing I did was bring in brighter steel colors in order to highlight areas like above the eye on the shield, or areas that would really catch a lot of light. Steel is obviously quite reflective, and I wanted it to look exceptionally bright on this model, because Vasilik is not, it seems to me, a model that would be exceptionally weathered. Like Slaanesh models do tend to be very vain. So by focusing on re-highlighting and bringing back color and saturation that I think I lost in my earlier glazes, I'm able to make this guy kind of pop on the tabletop. So one of the last things that I do is I come back in and look for areas that I haven't completely painted or that I'm not totally satisfied with. One of the areas that I noticed that needed a little bit of love was this little container here on his side. I just used a little bit of bright blue ink, which is super glossy, to paint the Zenithal overcoat. And that just kind of sold the idea of a bright blue glass. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but I also took the opportunity to just go around and try to find areas that I'd missed or areas that I'd neglected, and give them that last little bit of attention that they needed. Finally, I came back in with some brighter highlights, some brighter steel in order to get some of the metallics, and then I also blacklined the base. There are many ways to do this, but there's only really black that works. So just use whatever black that you have in your collection and make sure to get that baseline nice and dark. It really helps the model. It will do a lot of work for you. If you don't do this already, highly recommend you start. And also I painted in some eyeballs on the shield because I think it needed some irises. And with that, we are done. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. This has been a lot of fun. I know it's pretty terribly edited, but thank you for watching along. And hopefully I can have some more content out for you guys. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, my name is Tom. This is Knick-Knack Minis, and thanks for watching.